Miss Marple and the Crime That Was Never Solved. Chapter 1. The village that never forgot. The countryside unfurled in a soft expanse of green and gold as Miss Marple's carriage meandered through the twisting lanes toward Little Wham. A village seemingly frozen in time. It rested between undulating hills, its thatched roof cottages arranged in tidy rows, their gardens overflowing with late summer roses. At first glance, it appeared to be a tranquil haven, the kind of place where the most scandalous event might involve a misplaced knitting needle or an overcooked sponge. Cake at the church fed. But Miss Marple had learned through both experience and observation that villages often harbored the deepest of secrets beneath their tranquil facades. As the carriage came to a halt before Redern House, Margaret Redern stepped onto the porch, waving warmly. "Jane, my dear, it's been far too long." Miss Marple descended carefully, accepting her old friend's embrace. Margaret had aged gracefully, her silver hair pinned neatly, her sharp eyes still filled with kindness. "I do hope you don't mind a quiet visit," Margaret said as they stepped inside. "Little Wham isn't exactly bustling. I have always found that small places hold large intrigues," Miss Marple replied with a knowing smile. Margaret chuckled but didn't argue. Instead, she gestured toward the tea tray already prepared. "You must be tired from your journey. Let's have some tea before supper." Miss Marple settled into it. In the armchair, I surveyed the cozy sitting room, where charm enveloped every corner. Yet, an unsettling weight hung in the air, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Margaret, pouring the tea with a quiet demeanor, finally broke the silence, her voice unusually soft. "There's something you should know about this village." Miss Marple merely lifted a brow. She had suspected as much. That evening, Margaret took Miss Marple along to a small gathering at the vicarage where a few of the village ladies met for their weekly tea. It was the sort of occasion Miss Marple relished, not merely for the conversation, but for the opportunity to observe. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Dunley, presided over the table, her manner bustling and efficient as she ensured everyone had the correct balance of milk and sugar. Beside her sat Dorothy Lane, the housekeeper of Harrington House, whose hands trembled slightly as she stirring her tea. Miss Marple remarked, "I do hope you find our little village agreeable," said Mrs. Dunley. "It's quite uneventful, I'm afraid." "I find uneventfulness rather deceptive," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. "It is often in such places that the most intriguing stories lie buried." A silence followed, small yet distinct, a silence that felt out of place. A fleeting exchange of glances, a tightening of shoulders. Then, as if compelled by something unseen, one of the women, Mrs. Carter, sighed and said, "It was around this time of year, wasn't it, when Violet disappeared?" The shift in atmosphere was almost palpable. Dorothy Lane clinked her spoon against her saucer as though the mention of the name had made her hands unsteady. Mrs. Dunley pursed her lips. Miss Marple merely took a measured sip of her tea. "Violet, how many years has it been?" Margaret asked softly. 30, murmured Mrs. Dunley. 30 years since Violet Harrington vanished, and no one ever found out what truly happened to her. "She ran off," said another voice, one of dismissal, forced and fragile. "Did she?" Miss Marple asked, lightly, "or is that simply what one wishes to believe?" Another silence descended, and this time it felt weightier. In the corner of her eye, Miss Marple observed Dorothy Lane's fingers tightening around her cup, her knuckles turning pale. Something was dreadfully amiss here. These women were concealing more than they let on, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover the truth. The village garden had always been meticulously maintained, its rose beds neatly trimmed and its pathways free of weeds. Yet, when the gardener, old Mr. B.S., had been digging near the ivy-covered wall that morning, his spade had struck something small and metallic, a locket. Miss Marple turned the delicate object over in her fingers, her sharp eyes scanning the engraved initials, V.H. Violet Harrington. A hush fell over the small gathering of villagers who had come to witness the discovery. Even the usually chatty Mrs. Dunley had gone silent, her lips pursed tightly. "It was found beneath the ivy," the vicar explained, his voice measured. "Buried. Strange place for a locket to end up," Miss Marple murmured. "Particularly one that belonged to a young woman who was supposed to have run away." Dorothy Lane, the housekeeper of Harrington House, clutched her shawl more tightly around her shoulders. "Perhaps she lost it," she said too quickly. Miss Marple noted the tension in Dorothy's fingers, the way she avoided looking at the locket directly. Perhaps, she agreed mildly. But inside, she knew better. A lost trinket would have been found in a lane, a bedroom, a sitting room not buried beneath layers of earth and ivy. She let her gaze drift to the assembled faces, searching for the telltale signs of unease. The locket had remained concealed for a purpose, and someone was aware of it. By the time the locket was brought indoors, murmurs had started to circulate through the village like the crisp autumn breeze. Miss Marple didn't need to listen closely to catch them. 30 years had passed, and now this? Why would it be in the vicarage garden? Perhaps it was best to leave the past undisturbed. The villagers exchanged glances, tiny sparks of concern flickering between them like a candle's unsteady glow. Miss Marple observed them all, the slight hesitations, the averted gazes, the way fingers curled into coat pockets. Clutching the edges of her scarf, she observed the peculiar behavior of those around her. People with nothing to conceal did not act in such a manner. Turning to Margaret Reed Dern, who had been unusually silent, she inquired, "My dear, what do you make of it?" Margaret sighed, her unease palpable. "It's unsettling, Jane. That locket Violet was wearing the last night, she was seen it has now resurfaced in the garden after all this time." She shook her head, a sense of foreboding in her expression. "It means something." Miss Marple gently patted her friend's hand. "Yes, Margaret," she replied thoughtfully, "I rather think it does." And whatever it signified, it was evident that someone in Little W was wishing it would remain undiscovered. Later that evening, as the village settled back into its customary tranquil rhythm, Miss Marple sat by the drawing-room fire at Red Fern House, her knitting resting in her lap. Margaret busied herself with tea preparation, yet even she appeared preoccupied. "What troubles you, my dear?" Miss Marple inquired softly. Margaret paused, then let out a breath. "It's just that after all these years, Jane, people had come to terms with Violet's absence. Or so I believed. But now," she placed the teapot down with an unnecessary force. You could see their faces, the unease etched upon them. It was as if someone had been reminded of a ghost they had long tried to forget. Miss Marple nodded. "That is the most telling part of all." Margaret frowned. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking in a steady rhythm. "People do not fear the unknown, Margaret. They fear the truth." And Miss Marple was quite certain that the truth about Violet Harrington was far from forgotten. It was merely waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 2: The Last Night. Of Violet Harrington, the past had a way of leaving traces even when people tried to forget. Miss Marple understood this deeply. She sat in Margaret Reed Dern's parlor, her hands lightly resting over her knitting, her mind engaged with the enigma of Violet Harrington. 30 years prior, a young woman had departed Harrington House, distressed after a quarrel, and had vanished without a trace. It had been a scandal at the time, of course, but one that had gradually faded into hushed conversations. A runaway, they speculated, or perhaps a tragic accident. Yet now with the locket's discovery brought the past crashing into the present once again. Margaret sat across from her, frowning. Violet was a governess at Harrington House. You see, polite, clever, and well-liked. Miss Marple nodded, yet something seemed to trouble her enough to consider leaving. Margaret hesitated. On the night she vanished, whispers circulated about a quarrel with someone at the house. Miss Marple's fingers paused over the wool in her lap. Who? Margaret sighed. No one could say for certain, but she was last seen walking away from Harrington. In the dim light of evening, a house stood with an air of melancholy. A young woman wandered the night, accompanied by her troubled governess, both burdened by unspoken secrets. Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the window, where the last remnants of daylight slipped away. Had the young woman departed willingly, or had someone conspired to keep her from her path? Miss Marple had always held the conviction that silence could convey as much meaning as spoken words. The next morning, she set out for Harrington House, the once grand estate where Violet had lived and worked. Time had left its mark on the structure, with ivy creeping over its weathered walls, covered its windows, giving nothing away. She was greeted by Lady Evelina Lockwood, widow of the late Sir Reginald, a frail woman now, but still possessed of sharp, watchful eyes. "You wish to ask about Violet Harrington," she said, her voice measured. Miss Marple inclined her head. "It is a name that has been on many lips lately." Lady Elenina's lips pressed into a thin line. A most unfortunate affair, but I'm afraid we can offer no insights. And yet her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea. Beside her, Thomas Lockwood, now a barrister, leaned back. In his chair, his expression remained carefully neutral. "It was a long time ago," he said. "People move on." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Indeed, though it is remarkable how the past has a way of resurfacing when least expected." The third presence in the room, Dorothy Lane, the housekeeper, remained silent, her gaze fixed downward, her hands clenched in her apron. Too many unspoken words, too many secrets left to rot beneath the weight of time. Miss Marple sipped her tea, watching them all. Somewhere in this house lay the truth of what had transpired with Violet Harrington was a mystery Miss Marple was determined to unravel. She had always held the conviction that the past never fully vanished. It simply lay in wait, biding its time until it could emerge once more. In Little Wyham, that moment had finally come. Seated across from Edwin Carter, the village's oldest inhabitant, in his unassuming sitting room, she sensed the weight of history. Though he had been much younger when Violet Harrington disappeared, his recollections remained vivid. "That night, you see," he began, leaning in closer. "There was something peculiar, something I never quite forgot." Miss Marple listened intently. "I was out late," Edwin continued, "checking on my mare who'd gone lame. That's when I saw a lantern moving in the woods behind Harrington House." His brow furrowed. "Didn't think much of it at the time. Thought it might be one of the stable hands." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused mid-stitch. "But you now believe it wasn't?" Edwin shook his head. "No one ever admitted to being out there that night. And by morning, well, Violet was gone. A lantern in the woods at the very hour of her disappearance signaled a meeting or perhaps something far more sinister." Miss Marple set her knitting down. "Mr. Carter, would you say the figure holding the lantern was waiting for someone?" He hesitated. "I would say," he murmured, "they were looking for something." Miss Marple considered this. Looking for what or for whom? Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most useful answers often came from those who refused to speak at all. Dorothy Lane, the housekeeper of Harrington House, had been in service there since before Violet's disappearance. If anyone knew what had transpired that night, it was her. "You must forgive an old woman's curiosity," Miss Marple said pleasantly, stirring her tea. "I find the past so fascinating, don't you?" Dorothy gave a tight smile. "I prefer not to dwell on it, Miss Marple." And yet Miss Marple observed, "You trembled when Violet's name was mentioned at the vicarage tea." Dorothy's hands tightened around the tablecloth. "I don't recall." "Ah, but you do." Miss Murley's voice was gentle yet firm. "You were here that night. You saw what no one else did." Dorothy's breath caught, just a hint of tension in her voice. "It was a terrible night," she murmured, wishing to forget. Miss Marple leaned back. "For some, perhaps, but not for everyone." Dorothy remained silent, her quietude revealing more than words could convey. Miss Marple sat in thoughtful silence, turning the small silver locket over in her hands. It had been buried in the vicarage garden, far from Harrington House, lay distant from the last sighting of Violet. It felt illogical unless it had been intentionally positioned there. She recalled the lantern in the woods, the housekeeper's trepidation, and the unvoiced truths hidden within the village's quietude. Miss Marple's eyes shifted to Margaret. "My dear, doesn't it strike you as odd that Violet's most cherished belonging would turn up so far from her home?" Margaret paused, contemplating. "You suspect someone relocated it?" Miss Marple affirmed. "Indeed, but not recently. I believe it was interred there many years ago. Someone wished to mislead anyone who might ask questions." Margaret shuddered. "But why?" Miss Marple's eyes darkened. "Because Margaret Violet Harrington never left this village, and someone went to great lengths to ensure no one ever found out." Chapter 3. Secrets Behind Locked Doors. There were places in the world where time moved forward, where the past was a memory, a whisper of what once was. Harrington House was not one of those places. Miss Marple walked through the grand iron gates, the gravel crunching softly beneath her shoes. The house loomed ahead, its stone walls weathered by time, its windows dark, reflecting nothing. A house that had not changed in 30 years, a house that did not want to forget. She was led into the drawing room, where the scent of old books and fading roses lingered in the air. Silence stretched between the high walls, a silence that was not peaceful but weighted, as if something unspoken had settled into the very fabric of the house. Lady Elenina Lockwood, widow of the late Sir Reginald, sat by the window, her frail hands resting lightly on the arms of her chair. "You wish to see me, Miss Marple," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Miss Marple took a seat opposite her, carefully observing the woman's expression. "I do hope my visit is not an inconvenience." "Inconveniences are for those who have the luxury of time," Lady Elenina murmured. "I have little of it left." Miss Marple noted the way her fingers twitched against the fabric of her gown, a nervous habit perhaps, or something else. "You were here the night Violet Harrington disappeared," Miss Marple said gently. "That must have been a dreadful time." Something flickered in Lady Elenina's gaze. "Dreadful, indeed. Yet time has a peculiar way of dulling such feelings." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Does it? Because if that were true, Harrington House would not feel so very haunted." The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth did little to dispel the chill that had settled in the room. Lady Elenina's eyes remained fixed on the window, watching the world outside with a gaze that perceived not what was, but what had been. "There are things one regrets, Miss Marple," she finally said. "Things one carries until the very end." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly in her lap. "Regret is an interesting thing, Lady Elenina. It does not come to those who are entirely blameless." A pause, too long, too telling. Lady Elenina's lips pressed together. "I will not speak of it." Miss Marple tilted her head, studying the woman before her. "Of course, it is only that I find it curious. When one carries such regret, one is often eager to unburden oneself." Lady Elenina's grip on the arm of her chair tightened. "Some burdens are meant to be carried." The fire crackled again, filling the silence between them. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Lady Eleanor, was it Sir Reginald's burden as well?" At this, the woman stiffened, her breath catching ever so slightly. A small reaction, small enough that someone unobservant might have missed it. Miss Marple did not miss it. Lady Ellen rose abruptly, her hands shaking. "You must excuse me. I am quite tired." Miss Marple stood as well, inclining her head. "Of course, my dear. But you see, when one carries a burden for too long, one forgets it was never meant to be." "To be theirs alone," Lady Elenina did not reply, but her silence spoke louder than words. Somewhere in this house, the truth was waiting to be set free. Miss Marple had always believed that a guilty conscience rarely revealed itself through words. More often, it was found in the pauses between them, in the tightening of a jaw, the flicker of an eye, the measured control of a breath. Thomas Lockwood, now a barrister of some standing, sat across from her in the Harrington House drawing room. His posture was relaxed, yet his fingers drummed lightly against the arm of his chair, a rhythm too deliberate to be idle. "Such a long time ago," he remarked, reaching for his tea. "A sad business, of course, but it's hardly relevant now." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "Curious, isn't it? How the past has a way of becoming relevant when one least expects it." He gave a polite smile. "I suppose people enjoy their mysteries." Miss Marple returned the smile, though hers was a fraction sharper, a touch more knowing. "Oh, I do think there is quite a difference between enjoying a." In the midst of mystery and an inescapable tension, one finger rested against the chair as Miss Marple maintained her light tone. "Violet's locket was discovered in the vicarage garden. It certainly raises questions." Thomas's smile remained intact, yet a subtle shift flickered behind his eyes, hinting at an almost imperceptible tension. "Just a coincidence, I suppose," he remarked, reaching once more for his tea. Miss Marple nodded, placing her own cup down. "And yet, Mr. Lockwood, the most intriguing aspect of coincidences is how rarely they prove to be genuine." She had long since realized that homes, much like individuals, harbored their own mysteries, and occasionally, attempts were made to conceal them. She lingered in the shadowy hallway of Harrington House, her gaze locked onto a portrait that seemed incomplete. Sir Reginald Lockwood, in his youth, sat with an air of pride and strength in the oil painting. His features, defined and authoritative, were rendered with exquisite precision. Yet, next to him lay an empty space where another figure had once existed. The canvas, once intact, had been intentionally modified. "How peculiar," Miss Marple mused. It seems that someone has been removed. Lady Elenina, standing just behind her, did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet. It was damaged, she said. Of course, Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. Though I wonder why the damage was so very precise. Not the entire painting, just the figure next to Sir Reginald. Lady Eleanor's lips tightened. It is of no importance. Miss Marple's gaze lingered a moment longer before she turned away. But she knew better. That missing figure had once meant something, and now someone had ensured they were forgotten. As Miss Marple prepared to leave Harrington House, something caught her attention, a flicker of movement from the servants' quarters. She glanced towards the small hearth in the corner of the room, where Dorothy Lane, the housekeeper, stood hunched over the fire, her hands moving quickly. Miss Marple took a step closer. A rather warm evening for a fire, is it not? Dorothy startled slightly, but did not turn. There was clutter old letters, nothing of consequence. The flames crackled, licking hungrily at the edges of yellowed paper, ink smudging and curling before turning to ash. Miss Marple watched in silence, noting the tremor in Dorothy's fingers, the quickened breath, the way her eyes remained fixed on the flames as if willing them to consume more than just paper secrets perhaps, or regrets. Miss Marple's voice was soft but certain. You know, my dear, it is a rather interesting thing about the past. It has a most remarkable habit of refusing to stay buried. Dorothy said nothing, but her hands clenched tightly at her sides, telling Miss Marple all she needed to know. Chapter 4. The Confession That Never Was. There was always something curious about letters that were never sent. A letter once written carried intent. And if that intent had been strong enough for Violet Harrington to put pen to paper, then why had she never sent it? Miss Marple sat with Margaret Redern, a faded newspaper clipping spread out on the table before them. The headline was a stark reminder of the past. The missing governess, with no trace found. Margaret exhaled. She was going to leave Jane. That much was clear. Miss Marple nodded. A resignation letter, written but never delivered, indicated a decision made but never acted upon. Margaret's brow furrowed. Perhaps she changed her mind. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. Or perhaps someone changed it for her. She let the silence settle, observing as Margaret absorbed the implications, a young woman frightened enough to resign, only to vanish. Before she could respond, Miss Marple inquired, "Do you know what was in the letter?" Margaret hesitated. It was never found, or rather, by the time the police arrived, it had already been destroyed. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. "Destroyed, you say?" Margaret nodded. The only person who claimed to have read it was Father Collins. Miss Marple set her knitting aside. A resignation letter that no longer existed, a confession that had been read and then lost. Perhaps not lost, she thought. Perhaps erased. Miss Marple had long believed that the dead often held more answers than the living were willing to provide. The village church was cool and dimly lit, its stained glass windows casting muted colors over the wooden pews. The current vicar, Reverend Phelps, regarded Miss Marple with mild curiosity as she folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I do hope I'm not troubling you," she said, her voice warm. "It's just that I've been thinking about Father Collins and his rather remarkable memory." Reverend Phelps gave a small smile. He was a great man. The villagers trusted him with many things, Miss Marple. She tilted her head, recalling what she imagined to be Violet Harrington's last words. The vicar's smile wavered. "Ah, that matter," Miss Marple said, leaning in just a touch. "I understand Father Collins read her resignation letter before it was destroyed. Do you know if he ever noted his thoughts on it?" Reverend Phelps paused, a meticulous man by nature. He kept a personal journal. Miss Marple's face remained impassive, yet inside, she felt a spark of certainty. "A journal, you say?" "Yes. He often recorded his reflections on village matters. Naturally, they were never intended for an audience." Miss Marple's knitting needles rested quietly in her lap. "And this journal, does it still exist?" The vicar sighed. "It's locked away in a cabinet. The key was lost after his passing." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. A missing key, a forgotten journal, a letter destroyed before the police could read it. The past, it seemed, was intent on staying concealed. Miss Marple had always held the belief that when a secret yearned to remain hidden, it often required remarkable measures to do so. She sat in the vicarage study, hands folded neatly in her lap. as Reverend Phelps leaned back in his chair, brow furrowed. Father Collins was a meticulous man. He said he wrote everything down: reflections, confessions, observations. He believed it was his duty to record what he knew, even if he could never share it. Miss Marple nodded. And you believe he wrote something about Violet Harrington? The vicar sighed. It would be unusual for him not to. Miss Marple's fingers tapped lightly against the arm of her chair. And this journal locked in a cabinet in the vestry, he said. It has been there since he passed. Miss Marple tilted her head. Surely you have the key. Reverend Phelps hesitated. That's just it, he admitted. The key was lost shortly after his death. We searched, but it was never found. Miss Marple gave a small smile. Ah, that is rather convenient, wouldn't you say? The vicar let out a weary sigh, rubbing his temple. I suppose it is, but what can one do? Miss Marple simply reclined in her seat. Her expression was thoughtful, shaped by the understanding that when a key goes missing, it is rarely lost, but rather taken. This implied that someone was already aware of the contents within that journal. The night hung still, the air heavy with the kind of silence that foreshadows a storm. Miss Marple, stirred from her slumber by a knock at the door, discovered Margaret Redern standing in the dim hallway light, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. The church, Margaret whispered. Someone's broken in. In mere moments, Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage, where Reverend Phelps stood in the doorway, his face ashen. The cabinet, he uttered, his voice thick with disbelief. The lock had been forced from within. The lingering aroma of splintered wood and frigid air filled the space. Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to the cabinet, its door ajar and its contents in disarray. Reverend Phelps stepped closer, searching frantically. After a brief pause, he turned back to them, his expression somber. The journal, he stated, it's gone. Miss Marple exhaled softly, her thoughts aligning like pieces of a puzzle. Someone had waited 30 years to remove the last written record of Violet Harrington's final days. And now it was too late to stop them. The next morning, the village hummed with quiet speculation. A church break-in, a stolen journal, and a truth that seemed determined to remain buried. Miss Marple sat by the window of Red Fern House, watching the street below her, knitting untouched beside her. Margaret sighed. I don't understand it, Jane. Who would risk so much for something so old? Miss Marple looked up. A person who understands that time does not erase guilt. It only buries it deeper. Margaret frowned. But the police. Miss Marple held up a hand. My dear, the police look for criminals. What we are dealing with is a conscience. Margaret shivered. You think the person responsible is still in this village? Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. I do not think it, Margaret. I know it. Because whoever had taken that journal wasn't erasing history. They were erasing themselves from it. Chapter 5. The Shadow in the Garden. There was something. In the quiet of a village night, a stillness enveloped the air, heavy with unspoken secrets. Miss Marple lingered by the window of Red Fern House, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The evening had been restless, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of the stolen journal, when suddenly, a movement caught her eye in the darkness. At first, it was just a fleeting shadow, partially concealed among the hedges of the vicarage garden. Then, the unmistakable glow of a lantern pierced the damp night, illuminating the scene. Someone was out there, searching, digging, intent on uncovering something hidden. Miss Marple's breath remained steady as she observed. The figure moved cautiously, pausing every few moments to glance over their shoulder. They were not a passerby. They had come with purpose. A moment later, a sudden disturbance, a dog barking in the distance, the shuffle of feet against the earth. The shadows stiffened, and then in an instant, they were gone. Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly over the armrest. It was the same place where Violet's locket had been found. And if someone was still searching after all these years, then that meant only one thing. There was something else hidden in that soil, and by morning, Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. The dawn light showed no signs of the intruder, no footprints, no trace of their presence, only the disturbed earth near the vicarage hedge, where the soil had been turned not by nature, but by hands eager to reveal or hide. Miss Marple, equipped with an old garden trowel, knelt before the spot. She had always held the belief that truth, much like seeds, had a way of resurfacing when least expected. Margaret Redern stood nearby, wringing her hands. Jane asked, Are you quite certain Miss Marple's tail struck something solid? A pause, a breath. Then, with care, she brushed away the loosened dirt. An old leather glove. Margaret inhaled sharply. It looks. Miss Marple turned it over gently, revealing the unmistakable stains of dried blood. A chill passed between them, though the morning air was warm. Miss Marple straightened, brushing the soil from her gloves. Violet Harrington had never left this village. And now, after all these years, her story was finally beginning to unfold. The past had a way of resurfacing when least expected. And now, after 30 years, it had quite literally come to the surface. Miss Marple turned the worn leather glove over in her hands, her fingers brushing across the unmistakable dark stains that had seeped deep into the fabric. Blood, dried and faded, but there nonetheless. Margaret Redern, standing beside her, swallowed hard. Good heavens, Jane. Do you suppose it could be? Miss Marple nodded. Yes, my dear. I rather think it could be a blood-stained glove buried near the spot where Violet's locket had. It has been discovered. It was not mere chance. Nothing ever is. Margaret's voice trembled. But why this place? Why entomb it here? Miss Marple brushed a bit of soil from her fingers. Because, Margaret, some things are not meant to be found. Margaret exhaled shakily. And yet here it is. Miss Marple's expression remained unreadable. Yes, here it is. A clue long hidden. A piece of evidence long buried. And now the first real proof that Violet Harrington had not merely vanished, but had met a fate far more sinister. The question now was, who had buried it, and, perhaps more importantly, who had hoped it would never be found. Miss Marple had always believed that guilt did not often reveal itself in confessions, but in denials spoken too quickly. At Harrington House, she sat opposite Thomas Lockwood, the polished, self-assured barrister, the blood-stained glove resting neatly upon the table between them. This was found in the vicarage garden, Miss Marple said lightly. Most peculiar, don't you think? Thomas hardly gave it a second look at decayed, old glove. I couldn't grasp its significance. Miss Marple smiled. Gently, do you see how very interesting it is? His fingers drummed against the arm of his chair. It proves nothing. Miss Marple tilted her head. Ah, but that is the most curious thing about evidence, Mr. Lockwood. It does not need to prove something immediately. It only needs to exist. Thomas's expression remained carefully neutral, but his shoulders tensed ever so slightly. Miss Marple did not press further. There was no need. His reaction was answer enough. Margaret caught up with Miss Marple as she stepped out into the autumn air. Voice low, he didn't seem particularly concerned. Miss Marple's lips curled into a faint smile. No, my dear, he did not. Margaret frowned. You don't think he could be? Miss Marple patted her friend's arm. I think, Margaret, that people do not dismiss things unless they very much wish them to disappear. The glove, the missing resignation letter, the stolen journal, every thread led back to the same place. Violet Harrington had known something, and for 30 years, someone had ensured that her knowledge had been erased. But now the erasers were beginning to show, and Miss Marple, ever so patiently, was filling in the gaps. Chapter 6. The Crime That Was Never Solved. Some secrets, no matter how deeply buried, had a way of demanding to be found. The stables at Harrington House had long since fallen into disuse. The wooden beams sagged under the weight of time, and the scent of damp hay clung to the air. But Miss Marple's interest lay not in the pastures or the stalls, but in the far end where the stonework appeared oddly uneven. She stood beside Inspector Graves, her hands folded neatly in front of her. As the constables toiled at the deteriorating mortar, she pondered the rather inconvenient placement of the wall. The inspector, a man more familiar with uncomplicated crimes, exhaled sharply. If you're correct about this, Miss Marple. The last brick crumbled away, revealing a hollow space beyond. The air that escaped was dense, thick with the unmistakable weight of years long past. And then, in the faint light, they beheld it, a skeletal figure slumped against the stone, fabric clinging to bone, the outline of a body that had not seen the light of day for 3 decades. Margaret Redern gasped, clutching at Miss Marple's arm. Oh, Jane, she whispered. It's her, isn't it? Miss Marple's voice was steady. Yes, my dear, I rather think it is. Violet Harrington had never left Little Wyham. She had been here all along, silenced, hidden, forgotten, but no longer. The past had been unearthed, yet Miss Marple knew that the truth was still waiting to be revealed. She stood at the entrance of the hidden chamber, her gaze drifting over the remains of Violet Harrington. Not hurriedly discarded, not buried in the woods, or left behind in a rush. She had been positioned here with intention. Inspector Graves advanced, his brow furrowed. "Why the stables?" he murmured. "Why not a less conspicuous location?" Miss Marple examined the area, the remnants of a chair, a toppled lantern, the slightest hint of something charred long ago in the stone fireplace. Then, her gaze caught on it, a delicate silver chain ensnared in the remnants of Violet's sleeve. She crouched down, lifting it gently with her gloved fingers, a pocket watch. The engraving, though worn, was clear. Not Violet's initials, but another. Miss Marple turned to Margaret, her voice soft. "My dear, do you recall the missing figure in the Lockwood portrait?" Margaret's breath caught. "Sir Reginald's brother?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Henry Lockwood, the man erased from history." Violet had found something dangerous enough that she had to be silenced. And now, after 30 years, the truth was finally ready to speak. Miss Marple sat in the study of Harrington House, her hands folded neatly in her lap as Inspector Graves paced before the fireplace. "So that's it then," he said. Muttered Sir Reginald Lockwood killed Violet Harrington. The motive remains elusive, yet the evidence indicates he silenced her and concealed the truth alongside her remains. Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Inspector. The burden of suspicion rests heavily upon him." Graves sighed. "Regrettably, suspicion holds little weight now. He has been dead for nearly 15 years. Margaret Redern, seated beside Miss Marple, frowned. "So what happens now? Is there no justice to be found?" Miss Marple's voice was soft yet resolute. "Justice, my dear, does not always manifest as a form of retribution. At times, it's merely the truth breaking free." Graves ran a hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the unsatisfactory conclusion. If Sir Reginald was indeed the murderer, then the case perished with him. The soft clicking of Miss Marple's knitting needles filled the air. "Oh, Inspector, I believe you are missing a crucial point." Graves frowned, intrigued. "And what might that be?" Miss Marple looked up, her eyes glinting with quiet conviction. "Sir Reginald was a powerful man, yes, but even those of great power need assistance when it comes to concealing crafting sentences that weave together the shadows of history." She allowed the weight of her words to linger in the softly illuminated space. "No, Inspector," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "This case did not perish with Sir Reginald." Her eyes darted to the door, a flicker of urgency in her gaze. "Because the true accomplice is still very much alive." Silence enveloped the study, heavy and expectant. Margaret's breath hitched. The inspector's brow knitted in concentration, while Miss Marple remained poised, observing. Graves released a sharp breath. "Are you suggesting someone assisted him?" Miss Marple nodded. "A murder of this nature, a cover-up lasting 3 decades. It was not the work of one man alone." Margaret shuddered. "But who, Jane? Who else could have been involved?" Miss Marple's voice was steady. "Someone had access to the house. Someone who understood the art of secrecy. And most crucially, someone who still had a motive to maintain those secrets." The inspector straightened. "Are you suggesting that the individual responsible for concealing Violet's body remains in this village?" Miss Marple's gaze deepened. "Oh, Inspector, I don't merely mean within the village." She tilted her head ever so slightly towards the doorway where footsteps had just ceased on the other side. "I mean in this very house." The atmosphere in Harrington House had transformed. No longer weighed down by silence, it was now electrified with a sharper tension. Margaret grasped Miss Marple's hand. "You already know, don't you?" she whispered. Miss Marple gave a small smile. "Yes, my dear, I have known for some time." Margaret swallowed. "But you haven't said." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once more. "Because people reveal far more when they believe no one has found them out." Inspector Graves squared his shoulders. "And now," Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose to her feet. "Now, Inspector," she turned towards the doorway, where a lingering shadow hovered just beyond it. "I believe it is time for a confession. Final chapter. The truth, buried with time." There was no dramatic chase, no desperate escape. Only the slow, heavy weight of a secret that had been carried for far too long. Dorothy Lane sat in the dimly lit sitting room of Harrington House, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She did not meet Miss Marple's gaze, but then again, She did not need to. Miss Marple, ever patient, settled into the chair across from her, knitting resting idly in her hands. Her lap? "It is quite tiring, isn't it?" she said softly. Dorothy's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her apron. "I don't know what you mean." "Oh, but you do," Miss Marple replied gently. Keeping a secret for 30 years must have been terribly heavy to bear. Dorothy said nothing, but her silence was not defiance. It was fear. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm, almost soothing. "It was you, wasn't it? The one who helped him. The one who made sure Violet never spoke." Dorothy's hands began to tremble. She halted, swallowing hard. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Miss Marple nodded. "No, I don't believe you did." Dorothy's voice dropped to a whisper. "I thought it was over. I thought no one would ever find her." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "But I did, my dear, and now so has the world." Tears brimmed in Dorothy's eyes. "I was loyal. I had no choice." Miss Marple's tone remained gentle yet firm. "Dorothy, loyalty is not the same as innocence." And just like that, the final secret of Harrington House was finally spoken aloud. Dorothy's tears fell, quiet as she held the arms of her chair. The burden of 3 decades of silence pressed heavily on her delicate shoulders. Miss Marple allowed a pause before she spoke. "It was never solely about Violet, was it?" Dorothy shook her head in response. "No." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. "Sir Reginald had a brother, Henry Lockwood." Dorothy gasped softly. Miss Marple continued, revealing a name that had been erased, a life that had been obliterated from memory. Dorothy's lips quivered. He was a source of shame for the family. Sir Reginald ensured that Henry's name would never be mentioned again. Miss Marple's voice was. In the stillness, Violet discovered that Dorothy had nodded, her breath uneven. She wasn't meant to reveal it, yet she did. Once the truth settled in, her voice faltered. There was a desire to confide in someone. Miss Marple let out a sigh, and thus silence enveloped her. Dorothy buried her face in her hands, recalling Sir Reginald's insistence that it had to be done, that she would bring ruin to everything. "I only helped conceal her," she murmured, Miss Marple's tone tinged with sorrow. "Now, after all these years, the truth has resurfaced." Dorothy exhaled shakily. "I never intended for any of this." Of it to happen, Miss Marple stood smoothing her skirt. "I dare say, my dear, neither did Violet." And with that, the past was no longer buried. Some secrets were too dangerous to know. For Violet Harrington, knowledge had cost her everything. Miss Marple watched as Dorothy Lane sat motionless, her gaze distant as though trapped in the past. And perhaps she was. She found him, you see, Dorothy whispered, her voice hollow. "Henry Lockwood. He never truly disappeared. He only changed his name and started over somewhere far away. But Violet. She acknowledged him with a nod, and when she faced Sir Reginald, Dorothy felt a lump in her throat. She believed she could appeal to his sense of reason, that he would grasp the weight of Miss Marple's gentle words, but he did not. Dorothy shook her head in disbelief. He was enraged, insisting that she would destroy everything. Henry was dead to this family and would remain so. Margaret Redern, positioned by the window, murmured, "So he killed her." Dorothy's breath hitched. He hadn't planned it, but when she threatened to expose everything, her voice broke. She fell, hitting her head. The blood, it was everywhere. Miss Marple remained quiet, not interrupting, not condemning. Dorothy let out a shuddering sigh, and then it was too late. Miss Marple exhaled softly. "So the girl who knew too much disappeared." Dorothy nodded. "And I helped him. I helped him hide her." The words fell like stones into deep water. The ripples at last were reaching the surface. Dorothy Lane had spent 30 years spent harboring a secret that clung to her like a shadow. She sat, hands clenched around the fabric of her dress, her shoulders trembling. "I thought it would all come to an end with his death. Perhaps if I remained silent, I could convince myself it never happened." Miss Marple's voice remained steady. "But silence cannot erase the past, my dear." Dorothy let out a bitter laugh. "I understand that now." Margaret Redford placed a tentative hand on Dorothy's shoulder. "You have borne this burden alone for far too long." Dorothy's lips quivered. "I was loyal, but loyalty to the wrong person is its own kind of prison." Miss Marple regarded her with something almost like pity. "And now at last you are free." Dorothy lowered her head. The truth had finally been spoken, and the weight of it was unbearable. The sun was setting as Miss Marple made her way back through the village, the autumn air cool against her skin. The past had been unearthed, the truth set free. But the shadows of old crimes did not disappear so easily. A voice called out as she passed by the churchyard, an old villager standing by the gate, watching her with knowing eyes. Some crimes linger on, don't they? Miss Marple paused, adjusting her hat before meeting his gaze. A small, thoughtful smile graced her lips. No, she said softly, but neither does the truth. And with that, she continued on, leaving behind a village that would finally remember her.